All right, welcome everybody. It's great to see that I said earlier that Emily's here, Nellie's here, Lindsay's here, and of course Katie's here. So I'm so excited to have you, Katie. We've been looking forward to this session for a while. And so I'm really eager to hear more about this topic that is so important to us. And so today we're going to be talking about creating more inclusive and equitable content across the recruitment funnel. Today, we have Katie Jensen with us. She's the Associate VP of Insights and Analytics at the University of St. Thomas. So I'm super excited. Just to get started, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Olark. If you've been here in our other webinars, then I'm sure you're already a pro. You know what to expect. First of all, Zoom housekeeping. We have closed caption enabled. So if you need it, please go onto the bottom of your screen, click on closed caption, and then you can turn it on and it will show the subtitles. And then you can pick which language you want. And if you have any responses, you can respond in chat, or you can raise your hand, or you can ask a question in Q&A. So with that said, we are getting to the end of the webinar series. We've had Kyle talking about creator economy. If you haven't checked it out yet, the replay is available to you. Let me know if you didn't get it. We also had some talk about inclusive language, so specifically for enrollment teams and things that they can do. We had marketing to Gen Z, we had non-traditional students, and now we're talking about the whole recruitment funnel. So making sure that you have content. And there's a resource that Katie's going to be sharing that I'm excited for all of us to have access to. So a little bit about Olark. Olark Live Chat makes the simplest and most accessible way to connect with students when and where they need you the most. And we've spent 13 plus years perfecting tools that help teams reach their goals through timely messaging and support. And these are some of the schools that we've worked with so far. Higher ed clients love Olark's flexible chatbots, our automation tools, our commitment to accessibility, and a first of its kind Slate integration. And who am I? I'm Osai. I'm the head of demand gen here at Olark. I've been at Olark now for quite a while, and I also am an adjunct professor in one of the universities here in Toronto. So that's pretty cool. I've been a marketer for 10 plus years. So with that said, I'd like to introduce you to Katie because I want to give her all the time. She had some really fun stuff to talk about. As I mentioned, Katie Jensen is the Associate VP of Insights and Analytics at the University of St. Thomas, where she helps marketers make data-informed decisions, which is key. Data-informed decisions, like that's easier to get buy-in from decision makers, from everybody involved. And with that, she uses that data-informed decision to help to educate all the parties in the decision-making process. Her work at St. Thomas has ranged from examining prospective student enrollment journeys to refining marketing messages through consumer feedback, to guiding institutions' diversity, equity, and inclusion, and climate survey. So he's done the gamut. And prior to St. Thomas, Katie spent 13 years studying the consumer motivations behind food purchase decisions and applying those insights to brands like Quaker, Yoplait, Pillsbury, and Cascadian Farms. She also holds a BS in marketing with an emphasis in marketing research from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So welcome, Katie. You have a wealth of experience, and we're so excited to hear about how we can just put this knowledge that you have to use.
Well, thanks for having me and for the warm welcome. Let me share my screen here. Okay, so so here to talk to you about inclusive marketing and communications, and really our goal is to provide a tool and a practical approach to ensuring your work is as inclusive as possible. And we know that, working with students, particularly Gen Z, they want to associate themselves with brands, including their decision about where to go to get their higher education. They want to work with brands that meet their values, and increasingly this generation wants to see that inclusivity, wants to be able to see themselves with that brand and, you know, in part of your community. And so just a little bit about St. Thomas. We're the St. Thomas located in the Twin Cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis in Minnesota. And we are the largest private university in Minnesota. We have about 9,000 students, 6,000 undergrad, 3,000 graduate, and we're ranked among the top 20 national Catholic universities by US News. So we're best known for programs in business, particularly entrepreneurship and engineering. And we've recently launched a College of Health with a brand new school of nursing. And then kind of the other little tidbit I'll share is we just recently moved from Division III athletics directly to Division I. We're the first in history to make that leap. So it's a really fun time to be a Tommy. So that's a little bit about who St. Thomas is. And then I'll just give you some background on this tool we've developed. So our tool is called the DEI Viewfinder, DEI standing for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And this is just a little bit of a background on how we got there through the research that we've done. So our goal was to create an inclusive marketing and communications materials that can support the recruitment, retention, and engagement of a more diverse St. Thomas community. And so we started by doing some qualitative research. We partnered with a group at St. Thomas called SEED, which stands for Seeking Educational Equity and Diversity. That's a national program, actually. It's a wonderful program that we have a chapter of here at St. Thomas. We have cohorts every semester where we send staff and faculty through a process of many hours of engaging with DEI concepts. And one of the exercises that they do is taking content from around the university and just looking at it from a DEI lens. So they were a perfect group to take some of our items and put them to the test and see how are we doing. So we showed them a branding campaign. Our Opus College of Business had a branding campaign all around the giants of industry that we graduate. And so we have this kind of interesting visual around them standing tall within the landscape of the Twin Cities. Our undergraduate view book which is sort of a core piece that a lot of our other work kind of flows from. And so we put that in front of them, as well as some web pages that we developed to understand or to share so that our prospective students can understand what it will be like to be in different programs. So just a range of some of the key pieces that represent our work. And out of that, we were able to develop this tool that has increased our ability to spot issues and opportunities. So that tool is the DEI Viewfinder. And we say it is for anyone who develops or reviews content, and it can help us enhance the inclusivity of our works. It can be applied to anything: images, text, video, PowerPoint presentations. We even sort of joke, but it's actually true, that it impacts just our day-to-day interactions with our colleagues, emails we send. We're always taking a look at how we can be more inclusive. I will say that this is not meant to be a replacement for doing the work to learn and build empathy. It is not an exhaustive list. So, there I'm sure are other things that we should be cognizant of, and we'll probably add to this list over time. In fact, we're planning our next audit for this winter to potentially add to the list. And it's also not a simple set of rules to follow. As I give you examples throughout, these concepts are really nuanced. And so what might be fine in one situation isn't going to work in another, and vice versa. So it's a challenge for our team, particularly our creative team, to kind of, be able to take what the feedback we're giving them and say, okay, is this a don't ever do this situation, or is this a doesn't work in this context? And so, one thing that's been really nice is this has opened up conversation for our team and just made us a lot more comfortable talking through these topics and asking questions. And so our Viewfinder is really just 9 questions to ask in support of inclusive content. When we got the feedback from our seed cohorts, what we found is that the concepts weren't necessarily new to us because we had been on a DEI journey of learning and understanding. And so these weren't necessarily brand new topics we hadn't thought of, but we found that it was really helpful to be able to lay out what are the most common things that we're misstepping on, or the most common opportunities that we're missing. And then how can we provide a couple of examples to really bring them to life? And so that's what we'll share with you today. Is for each of these questions, we'll have a slide that talks a little bit about what we mean by the question, and then a second slide that gives you, 2 or 3 examples of where we maybe could have done better on it. So question number 1, is the content or image reinforcing any stereotypes or tropes? And I will say that on any of the example slides, the speech bubbles that you see throughout are the actual feedback we got from the participants. So keep an eye out for those throughout. So this one is all about thinking about the stereotypes that might be rooted in individual identities. Our brains move really quickly and categorize people and things, and think about and work really quickly to kind of put things into boxes. And that is, we're taking in information constantly. It's sort of a survival mechanism for our brains. Unfortunately, that means because of the society that we've been raised with, and we might have specific perceptions of people, for example, from a different socioeconomic status from us, or from a different faith from us. And so thinking and being aware of the stereotypes that you might hold, or that might be pervasive throughout society, is a good way to make sure that you're not reinforcing those stereotypes, which can often be harmful. And then we like to think about flipping the script. So being able to show somebody with a certain identity in a role that they aren't typically represented in is a great way to flip the script, both for the person who might be affected by a stereotype that we want to kind of untether, as well as the holder of the stereotype. And, we'll have an example of that later. So some examples here. On this top left, we have a faculty member talking to a couple of students, and the feedback on this one was around the doodles here. So you can see fun little doodles we included to bring a little life to the image, but somebody pointed out the blank lines in this thought bubble suggest that maybe this Black student is the one person in the room that's not getting it. Obviously not the message we wanted to share. And this thought bubble with the lines is something we use in other parts of our view book, and it didn't cause an issue there. So this is a great example of one of those. It's not to say you can never use that. It's the context of how it's used in conjunction with other things that makes it a potential issue. Here we have another page from the view book. This says, "Blessed are the nerdy," which is kind of our fun church humor tagline that we often like to use. And the feedback we got here is, Asians are often depicted as nerds. It's actually part of a really harmful model minority stereotype, and it's not something that we want to be reinforcing. And you'll see later, I have some examples of where we made some changes about how we flipped the script on it. And then finally, this bottom pair of items is a good example of how things in context can take on different meaning than they might by themselves. So on the left here, we have a white man standing kind of strong within the buildings, and the headline says, "Step into your power with an MS in healthcare innovation." Meanwhile, we have a man of color who's kind of tentatively peeking around the building with a tagline that talks about small thinking not being in our DNA. And of course, the small thinking is we're saying that's not how we are, but it's just, right, the combination of the two doesn't feel very equitable. And so you can see the feedback that we got from our seed cohort. When you put them up next to each other, it just doesn't feel like we're treating these two identities very equitably. Okay, question number 2, are we advocating body positivity? Really important here to represent a variety of shapes and sizes, abilities, gender expressions, ages, and not just who we show, but how we show them. So avoiding sexualizing or objectifying different audiences. And then don't underestimate the power of subtleties to signal inclusivity. And I have a great example of that actually on the next page. So this is from our biology webpage. and it shows a student checking out a toad. And you can see he's got a wedding ring on. And so that's just a nice subtle way of maybe showing a non-traditional older student. Here we have another image from our Opus Giants campaign. And the comment here was that, hey, this is great. I didn't immediately see man or woman. And so having this more androgynous or non-binary gender representation was really appreciated. On the other hand, and this is another example of the broader context, every person in the Opus Giants campaign was fit and thin. And so does that send a message that only people who kind of fit that mold are going to be welcome and feel like they belong in our program? Clearly not. And so all of this is about what is the message that you might be unintentionally sending to somebody who's looking at this and considering whether St. Thomas is the right place for them. Question number 3, have we examined image treatment in context? Here we're talking about a few different things. The first is about how groups are represented in relation to one another. So do they have specific roles when they're shown in an image? Is the way that the quality of the photo consistent? Do we always have people not in the majority at the bottom of a web page versus at the top? All of those things, how people are treated in context with one another, can again send a message that you either do or do not intend. And then striking a balance between representation and actual diversity. We talk about this a ton. It's probably one of the most common questions we get. You know, we actually just recruited our most diverse class of first-time first-year students ever, with 27% students of color. And so does that mean we should count up the people in our view book and make 27% of them be students of color? No, that's actually not how we handle it. What we're trying to do is say, okay, what's the context of this piece, and what would be the accurate representation of the students within it? And we keep a wide definition of diversity. Obviously, visually, racial differences are probably the most visible, but there's lots of types of diversity to be considering. So we want to think about that whole breadth. And then we want to say, okay, let's think about how we can make people feel seen, make people be able to see themselves here. We would never want to go to a point of people getting here on campus and going, hang on a second. Your view book suggested there were going to be a ton of people that look just like me here, and I'm not seeing that in real life. That's something we for sure want to avoid, but we do want to strike that balance between representation and aspiration versus actual levels of diversity. And so I'm going to just go to the next with the examples here. So this is a corner of a collage that's on the inside cover of our view book. Lots of fun images of different groups of students doing different things together. But what somebody pointed out is, unfortunately, the students of color in the collage were always shown alone, maybe studying or just off on their own and not socializing, where the ones where students were socializing tended to be primarily white students. So, right, something you want to watch out for. We would never want to suggest that students of color don't engage with other students on campus. Here we have our mechanical engineering page. These are a couple of expert excerpts from it. And somebody said, I love to see the women and the people of color on a web page for a STEM field. That's great to see, but is that setting expectations too high? And actually, our mechanical engineering program is very diverse and actually is above the national average in terms of female representation in a STEM field. So this is accurate for us, but we don't say that anywhere on the web page. So it's maybe an opportunity to clarify and be clear about what makes St. Thomas different and why this actually is a legitimate representation of our students. And then finally, on the bottom here, the Aristotle Fund is part of our business programs. It's a chance for students to have a fund to actually invest in businesses. And unfortunately, what happened here, and this happens often, especially when you're making web pages, things are sort of automatically cropped. There's lots of tools that just sort of do that, that tedious work for you. And unfortunately, what happened here is the one person whose face got a little bit cut off was the person of color in the picture. So again, it's just that treatment of how different groups are treated in relation to one another. Question number 4, have we double checked for suggestive or strongly associated content? This one's tricky because language changes constantly. Gestures, words that didn't have an association previously that do now, code words, idioms are really tough. If you find yourself saying, I wonder why we use those words to say that thing, that's probably a good opportunity to look it up and try to understand where does that phrase come from? Often those phrases are rooted in colonialism, in slavery, in things we don't want to associate ourselves with. On top of that, idioms often are difficult for people for whom English is an additional language. To understand, think about your international students, think about recently immigrated students. We want to make sure things are clear for them. And so just use care whenever you're using phrases that might not be literally interpreted by people. And then check for differences in meaning if it's viewed from someone else's perspective, different cultural lenses, changes in meaning over time. There's definitely generational differences in how people perceive words. And so some examples here, this is the back of a laptop in an image in the view book, and it says, make yourself Googleicious, which is just kind of a fun way to say, make it so that when someone Googles your name, they would find something cool, right? Well, what the feedback we got was a couple of things. One was, Googleicious seems unnecessarily sexual. What happened is people were taking this straight to Fergalicious. And if our prospective students don't know Fergalicious, their moms probably do at this point. And so, not something we would necessarily want to associate ourselves with, particularly as a Catholic university. And then do we want to associate ourselves with Google? I'm a marketer, and of course we leverage Google quite a bit in our work. So I'm not necessarily making a judgment on that, but it's a good question. If you're putting your name alongside another group's name, what do you know about them? Are there practices in terms of how they deal with DEI issues something you'd want to be associated with? How do they treat their workers? What are they known for? So these are just questions to ask yourself. And we're always really clear that this isn't about right or wrong. This is about having a conversation. So just because you point something out or bring something up does not mean that you have to make a change. It just means you have to have a conversation. And the more conversations we have, the more comfortable people are bringing forward things that they're seeing. And so we've, we don't always make changes when we get feedback. It's just important to talk it through and decide, how much of a risk is this? How much do we think people will be aware of Fergalicious, for example? And then on the bottom here, we have 2 students who are doing study abroad, and they are we actually have a photo contest every year for our students who study abroad to share their best images from their trips. So we get tons of great content from that. Unfortunately, in this case, a thumbs up is actually offensive in parts of Italy. And so even though it would be fine here, this kind of suggests that we've got students who are off. They're supposed to be immersing in another culture, and instead they're kind of putting their American culture on it. And so again, does this mean we would never use a thumbs up? No, it doesn't. We use a thumbs up in a ton of other places, but in this context, it suggests something different than what we would want to share about our students and their experiences. And yes, definitely share questions in the chat as we go, and I'll get to them as I can or at the end. Okay, question number 5, how can we make the text more inclusive? Here you want to think about checking for indications of privilege or position. That could include insider speak. There's tons of, every organization has acronyms or different words that they use. So be aware of those things, and also be aware of unintentionally talking down to a group of people. I have a good example of that on the next page. And then take care in introducing and acknowledging members of the community. The following three things are very nuanced, and so we don't have sort of a set approach to it. I will say, in my best rule for this is to lead with your person you are referring to. So when you think about pronoun use, we're really careful when we tell stories about our community members to ask them for what pronouns would they like us to use. Even if we know them and know the pronouns they might use as we're working with them internally, what they might want to include in an externally facing story about them might be different from what they're comfortable with while they're here on campus. Phonetic spellings, a really good way. We know it's important to get people's names right. It's a really good way to help people do that. However, it can also be really othering. Who's to say that my name is any easier to say than anyone else's? It's pretty common, a very common name here in Minnesota, but if you're not from here or you're not from this country, it might be really difficult. And so we consider, and again, let it lead with the subject of the story. And then person first versus identity first referencing. So person first referencing leads with the human. So when we talk about students who have financial challenges, we don't call them low income students. That's not a characteristic of them as a human being. They are students, so person first, students from a household with financial challenges. Meanwhile, there are some groups who prefer identity first referencing. So for example, the deaf and blind communities prefer that you lead with that identity. So a deaf person or a blind person, and they like that because it centers that identity as a positive thing and as something that clearly impacts their day-to-day quite heavily. That changes, and actually some communities, there's disagreement within the community. So again, think about leading with the subject of the topic you're talking about, and let them sort of guide that appropriate terminology. Autistic people are similar. Thanks for the question, Emily. The autistic community currently prefers identity first. So they currently prefer being referred to as an autistic person. That has changed over time though, and is something we kind of keep checking in on as we would tell those stories. But that is in particular one community that has had a bit of movement in terms of their preferences. Okay, let's look at some examples here. So when we introduce our faculty members on our web pages, maybe we should consider adding pronouns to the professor bios. When we share, this is our Opus College of Business, and it says, don't sweat the small stuff like your daily schedule. Our point being, you can fit this program into your daily life. But for people who are balancing a lot of things, who may be under-resourced, your daily schedule is actually super stressful. Even, I'm a mom of 2 young kids. My daily schedule is something I have to think about pretty hard, even from my privileged point of view. And so that could be talking down to somebody who's struggling with that, and we would never want them to think this isn't something that they could do. And then when you're talking about financial management at the undergraduate level, making sure we're using accessible language. If they haven't studied financial management yet, that's what we're inviting them to come here and do with us, then they don't know the terms related to financial management. That's what they're going to come to us to learn. So just making sure we use language that our audience can understand and relate to. Excuse me. Okay, question number 6. Are we addressing the range of accessibility needs? We want to think here about, yes, the Americans with Disability Act and the required ways in which we want to accommodate people. But there's a broad range of situations that pose accessibility needs. Students from families without an educational legacy, students from different socioeconomic situations, people with invisible differences like neurodiversity, for example. There's a lot of ways in which we work to support students and provide access to things that they need in order to be successful. And then, so we want to talk about those things. And then we also want to make sure, as we're talking about the selling points for our campus, what are the things that make us special? We want to make sure we are thinking about how that impacts our selling points and how their perspective might impact that. So, for example, we opened a couple of new dorms recently and renovated more of them. So we're talking frequently about that. We also have a new residency requirement where students need to live on campus for 2 years. So we know that there are students who either for financial reasons or cultural tradition reasons, or because they have responsibilities in the home, do need to live at home. So just making sure it's really clear for them, how do I go about getting an exception to that requirement? And then when we talk about our athletics, which we are doing a lot because of our move to D1, talking to students about, whether student tickets are free or cheaper to be able to actually take part and enjoy that experience. We also talk a lot about what's going on around the Twin Cities. We have wonderful arts and music, and there's tons of places that give student discounts. So just thinking about that extra layer of how do we make the things that make us special accessible to our students. Question 7 is, how can we infuse the organization's DEI work into our content? And so we know that consumers want to hear about the work that is being done. And so just looking for those opportunities to incorporate what are we doing and how are we supporting the journey that our community is on to a more equitable campus. Excuse me. And we want to aim to raise the bar, not just achieve the baseline. When you're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, the language tends to change really fast. And some of that is just the language, happens, and then the actions maybe don't live up to the language, right? And so things tend to evolve pretty quickly. And so we really want to think about not just a baseline, not just a safe space, for example, but we want to build belonging. We want to take that to the kind of next level. So when we talk about our Bachelor of Science in Exercise Science, which is a health-focused major, talking about, we know that our students are studying how different identities and different situations intersect with health topics. If we can be showing that that's part of what gets covered in the curriculum, that can really help people be seen and help people see that, oh, they do understand, and we are going to learn about what my experience might have been like in life. And then at the bottom here, we have this, this is the kind of diversity, the DEI page in our view book. And we really liked this language when we first wrote it. But in just a couple of years, the idea of, well, we respect and value every person, that's just a baseline. Going beyond that to say we celebrate and we honor the uniqueness of community members. They're encouraged to share their perspectives and bring their authentic selves, right? So it's taking it that step further. It's not just putting up with people, it's actually valuing them for who they are. Question number 8, do unconscious biases undermine stories of working for the common good? So at St. Thomas, we have a group called the Center for the Common Good, and they work with every faculty member and student who goes out into the community to engage in projects together to make sure that they are approaching it from a co-creation spirit, to not just come in and say, hey, I know exactly what the solution would be for this community that I'm not familiar with. So, elitism, white saviorism, colonialism, all of those things are about, thinking you might know better than a group that you're not a part of. And so we do really great work to make sure that our community members are prepared to go and partner with other communities to work together to solve issues, to raise up community voices, et cetera. Sometimes though, when we are, those of us who are responsible for telling those stories, we can let those biases creep back in. And so we really want to make sure that our content is reflecting that self-empowerment of the community. the inclusiveness of how we've approached that community, and that we're, you know, raising up the community's mentorship, their leadership, their own agency, so that it's a story of combined success, not St. Thomas kind of doing unto others. And so some examples here, we talk about, we have this really cool program where we're documenting street art. And so when we talked about it, we talked about the Midway neighborhood, which has been highly gentrified in recent years. And we said the Midway neighborhood is struggling with gentrification. And it almost sounded like we were saying it was the neighborhood's fault, right? So we need to be careful with our words. We could have said something more like they are faced with these outside forces that are causing gentrification, right? So just making sure it's really clear about the role the community plays. And then here, this is one of our education, this is from an education webpage. And here someone pointed out, you know, the people getting the degree in teaching are white, while the people being sort of helped or served are people of color. And this, especially because they're in uniform, kind of brought forth that kind of thought of colonialism and kind of stripping people of their own culture. And so I think, you know, this maybe could have benefited from a caption that could have better explained, you know, what is this school? Who is this man? What is he doing? You know, why is the work that he's doing important and being done in a way that's really about sharing with that community? And then our last question, question number 9, what other perspectives should we consider? So we just encourage you to continue learning and building empathy to spot issues and opportunities that might not be covered in this tool. Tap a colleague to review for another point of view, maybe somebody with a different lived experience from you, somebody else you know has been working hard on their own DEI journey. Someone just with fresh eyes who hasn't been so close to the project. Sometimes you're swapping in a picture and you're swapping in a headline and you're all, you know, you're kind of have this Frankenstein together thing. And then you realize, oh my gosh, when I put those together, it sent a completely different message that I didn't intend. And so it's really helpful just to have a fresh set of eyes. I will just caution, be really sensitive to colleagues that are in a marginalized group or a group that's not the majority where you work, because they are constantly being tapped and they're drawing on often negative experiences in order to help, and they're being asked to do it often without additional pay. Where we've started calling that representation fatigue, and just the pressure that people have been under to sort of represent an entire identity. It's not fair. And so as a cisgender white straight woman, that's part of why I'm trying to do this work and trying to share this with as many people as possible, because it is, we need more people to get involved and more people to be doing the work. And this tool really helps enable our whole team to be able to contribute to these conversations. And, you know, when you do need a specific perspective, or we've seen this even with translation for a while, we were trying to use internal team members to translate to other languages when it wasn't part of their job. We're not doing that anymore. So sometimes you need to hire a paid consultant and pay people for what we do. And finally, I will just give you a couple of examples of where we've had inclusive content in action.
So Katie, there was an anonymous question about how are you getting feedback on these items? Are you having surveys? Is this like a team discussion group?
Yeah, so the ones that I'm showing you today are ones from a specific project where we did an audit of some of our key pieces. And so that was a process where we actually had them mark up all of those pieces with their comments. And then we pulled together the themes we were seeing and had focus groups with them to kind of hear more and get more context around the issues. We also, when we have really big, important pieces, we have a team actually within our marketing insights and communications group, our DEI working group, where we can take things to say like, hey, I want to be really careful on this one from a DEI lens. Can we all take a look at it and get feedback? And then we've really made it kind of everybody's job on the team to make sure that every piece gets looked at every step of the way from a DEI lens. So our creative team is thinking about it before they show us their first draft. The person who's kind of the key requester of the item is thinking about it before they share it with our partners in the schools and colleges. So we're really, again, kind of trying to spread that work and open up the lines of communication so that when we do make a mistake or we do have a misstep, that we're hearing more directly from people because they know we're open to the feedback. I hope that answered the question. If not, please jump in again with clarification. Okay, so just a couple of examples where we made changes. I showed you this one with our Opus Giants campaign where the combination of these two just sent a message we didn't intend. And so this was a new version of it. You can see this man standing very confidently, lead in a big way, right? Shifting that from that small thinking to leading in a big way. And this appealed to a really broad audience. When we launched this new version on LinkedIn, it was a top 10 education ad that week. So you can see it's not just necessarily the group that might be offended by something or that if something might particularly appeal to. This appealed to a broad audience. And then here I showed you the kind of model minority myth stereotype that we were reinforcing with Blessed Are the Nerdy and showing an Asian student here. Well, we asked around and said, hey, we'd love to find somebody who can kind of authentically be this nerd. And Student Affairs immediately told us Elijah's the guy you got to look at. And so he actually dresses like this. And how often does a young Black man get to see himself teed up as the nerd? And how much better is this image than the one that we were previously using? The connection he brings, the eye contact. So we often find that when we pause and try to make things more inclusive, we actually end up with a way better product than we had initially. And so I'll just end with some tips for using it. So we talked a bit throughout about context. So review your content on its own, but also in the context of other things the audience it's intended for would see. Maintain a broad definition of diversity and remember intersectionality. So people have a myriad of identities that they identify with. And so remembering that there's a range and different people experience their identities in different ways. Know what you don't know. So, the DEI journey is lifelong. We're always learning and culture is always shifting around us. If I assume many of the people who are listening also work in a university setting or a college setting, there's tons of opportunities to learn, tons of experts to draw from. And so hopefully, like at St. Thomas, we have so many things we can engage in. So just encourage you to get involved and hear what's happening on campus, because most campuses do have a ton going on in the DEI realm. And ask a colleague to collaborate if you're not sure. Again, just with the warning to be careful not to overburden colleagues from marginalized groups. Remember that the intent is to surface issues to consider. Sometimes we look at this and go, oh my gosh, are we being too picky? Like, are we being too sensitive? And that's actually kind of the point. The idea is to look at it with a super critical eye and then have a conversation about it. Not everything identified has to be addressed, but it should be examined critically. And, sometimes we find too that people will, I'll see something and go, there's something about it that doesn't hit me quite right. And I think a couple years ago, I would have just kept my mouth shut because it felt like, oh, this is going to lead to, a bunch of edits, or I'm just not even sure. But now I will say something, and more often than not, there's going to be another person in the room who is like, I had the same feeling. Let's try to figure out what it is that's bothering us. And so we've caught some things because we were just more willing to speak up, more accepted, speaking up being more accepted as not an interruption to the process, but a really critical part of it. And then, use care when giving feedback on someone else's work. Nobody wants to hear that they made a misstep, particularly in the DEI realm. So focus on the impact versus the intent. So it's not to say, I can't believe you wanted to send this message, or I can't believe you, made this racist postcard, right? It's, I think this is sending a message we didn't intend. And here's why. And be sure to provide those details and answer questions so that a better solution can be found. And then finally, don't get discouraged. Inclusion is going to require more time, more revisions. We think it's totally worth it. And just reflect on issues that you uncover as a chance to learn and a chance to do better next time, not as a failure. So that's all I have to share. If you wanted to dive in deeper, we actually have a full continuing and professional education course. There's the link here, or you can always just reach out to me. I'm happy to talk or share what we've learned, or even take a look at something that you are wondering if there's an issue with.
Wow, awesome. Thank you so much, Katie, for sharing this and for sharing your contact. This has been useful. As you were going through it, I was just thinking about how it would be useful even for us, and how it would be useful for the community of people that were not able to attend live. So thank you so much for taking us step by step. For everybody here, if you have any questions, we have a few more minutes. Please share in the chat or raise your hand, or put in the Q&A box, and we'll read out the question. Otherwise, you can also just email me, and then we can always send the info to Katie, or just email Katie directly. Well, I'm seeing some thank yous in the chat, so we're all excited. We're all thankful. Thank you so much, Katie. I don't see any questions, so for now, I'll say farewell. And hopefully we'll see you again for something like part 2, where we can dive even more deeply into ways that we can become better in DEI.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your day.